I want to set the record straight with how I think Christians should interpret election results. And to do that, I'm going to be looking at three things straight out of the Bible, in fact. The first of those is, what does God think of politics? Really? I think it's in there. The second is, how would Jesus vote? And the third is, how should Christians respond to an election outcome? So we're gonna go right into it, and I'm gonna jump to Exodus 18, verses 13 and then 15. It says, "The next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge of the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening." And at verse 15, Moses answered, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions." Now, this form of government is what would be called a theocracy, because Moses was acting as an agent communicating directly with God. Nevertheless, it didn't go very well, and we can see how well it went when we jump ahead a little bit to where the Israelites actually come to a later prophet named Samuel asking for a king. In other words, transitioning from a theocracy to a monarchy, and it's here where we get into the meat of what God really thinks about politics. You'll hear it in his response to Samuel's request. So it says in 1 Samuel 8:4, "So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, 'You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead over us, such as all the other nations have.' But when they said, 'Give us a king to lead us,' this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, 'Listen to all the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights.'" So Samuel goes and tells the Israelites about the kinds of things that a king will do, like enlist soldiers and collect taxes. And at the end of this explanation, if we jump to verse 18, he ends it with, "When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we'll be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, "Listen to them and give them a king." So what I take from that is that God is not a big fan of having kings over his people. He would rather that the people were naturally and eagerly obedient to him. And that's just not the way that the world is going. And so he gives them a king. Now, much more time goes on, and we get to a much later period in Christian history. This is actually one of Paul's letters, and he's writing about how Christians should respond to authority. Now, if you've heard anything about Christians and government and election and voting, you've probably heard this one verse. This comes from Romans chapter 13, verse 1. And it says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves." That's interesting. Where is it? Where it says, "Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted." But that's not what we read back in Samuel 8. We read very explicitly that people instituted their king, and that God warned them against putting that authority in place, and he allowed them to do it. So do we have a contradiction here? Like, what is it? Did God put the kings of Israel in place, or did the Israelites do it and God just allowed it? And how do we interpret chapter 13 of Romans? Well, that's why I turned to the second topic in this video. Let's talk about how Jesus would have voted. So, how Jesus would have voted. That's right. I'm going to jump to Matthew 26:39. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet, not as I will, but as you will." And of course, you might recognize this from the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus is pleading to be delivered from the fate that awaits him, a crucifixion. Jesus casts his vote in this case. He says, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me. But he doesn't get the outcome that he voted for. And we can find out what happens in John chapter 19, verse 10. This is where Jesus is before Pilate. And Pilate says, "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said, "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." And then if we jump ahead, we read in verse 16, finally Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So, Jesus was a bit of an underdog when it came to voting, evidently. He was outnumbered by fellow Israelites and evidently by God himself, who had bigger plans in mind. And it didn't go his way. And Jesus called Pilate out on it, saying, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." He knew who was in charge. So when we're reading that conflict between 1 Samuel 8 and Romans 13, asking how can we reconcile this? Is it a contradiction? Look, sometimes when we try to interpret politics, when we try to interpret elections, we do so thinking that God depends on these elections. God doesn't depend on elections or politics. Politics depend on God. His will, his purposes are going to be carried out regardless of any result on this earth. And this is really the last thing I wanted to talk about. What do Christians need to do in the outcome of an election? And I think to answer this question, there's something we need to understand. This is in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. This is the election that matters. In him, we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will, in order that we, who were the first to put our hope in Christ, might be for the praise of his glory. The only election that matters is our election. Christ has elected us to be heirs with Christ, and our hope is in him. Everything else that we're talking about, that stuff that rises to the top of your feed on Facebook, it just bubbles to the top because it gets the controversy that earns its attention. That's not worth our attention as Christians. Voting is great. Politics, like love of country, these are great things. They are not ultimate things. They are indeed worldly things. And God's plan is going to be carried out regardless of any election results. So keep that in mind. Read the word. Find the truth for yourself. And God bless.